The steel door slammed shut with a sound so heavy it seemed to shake the whole building. Inside the tiny concrete cell, a man named Robert looked up slowly from his narrow bed. The clock on the wall said 11:47 p.m. Somewhere down the corridor, another inmate was shouting. Farther away, metal chains rattled against the floor. Then came the footsteps. Slow. Steady. A prison guard stopped outside Robert's cell and stared through the thick glass window without saying a word. Robert already knew what that meant. Someone nearby had lost their final appeal. Somewhere on death row, another execution date had just been set. The prison became strangely quiet. Even the shouting stopped. Men who had spent years pretending not to care suddenly sat still in their cells, listening for every sound. Because on death row in America, one man's execution notice reminded everyone else of the same terrible truth. One day, the footsteps could stop at their own door. Robert walked slowly toward the bars and looked into the dim hallway. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The air smelled of bleach, dust, and old concrete. He could not see the inmate whose date had been set. Nobody could. Most prisoners on death row lived alone, locked in isolated cells for almost 23 hours every day. But everyone felt it. The fear moved through the building like cold wind. Then the lights flickered once. And somewhere down the hall, a man began to cry. The sound echoed through the prison long after midnight. But to understand how men ended up living for years inside places like this, waiting day after day for execution, the story must go back many years earlier, to the long and controversial history of death row in the United States. For much of American history, the death penalty was considered normal punishment for serious crimes. In the 1800s, executions were often public events. Crowds gathered in town squares to watch hangings. Newspapers described executions in detail. Some people believed harsh punishment stopped crime. Others believed public executions were cruel and inhuman. By the early 1900s, many states began moving executions inside prisons, away from public view. New methods appeared over time. Hanging slowly disappeared in many places. Then came the electric chair. Later came gas chambers. Eventually, many states adopted lethal injection, which officials described as more humane. But another major change also happened. Executions became slower. Not the execution itself, but the legal process before it. As courts grew more careful about wrongful convictions and unfair trials, inmates sentenced to death gained the right to years of appeals. Lawyers challenged evidence. Judges reviewed cases. Some inmates claimed police misconduct. Others argued they had poor legal defense during trial. Because of this, death row slowly became a strange world where prisoners often waited not for weeks or months, but for decades. Some inmates entered death row in their 20s and grew old there. Some died of illness before execution dates ever arrived. Others were later proven innocent and released after spending years locked in isolation. And inside America's most secure prisons, daily life became a long routine of waiting. In Texas, California, Florida, and other states with large death row populations, inmates lived under strict conditions. Most spent nearly all day inside cells about the size of a bathroom. The walls were thick concrete. The beds were metal or cement slabs with thin mattresses. A toilet and sink sat only a few feet away from where inmates slept. The lights rarely turned fully dark. Privacy almost did not exist. Many prisoners described the silence as the hardest part. Others said the noise was worse. Men screamed through the night. Some argued with invisible people. Some hit walls for hours. Some stopped talking completely. Years of isolation damaged many minds. One former death row inmate later described it by saying, "Your body stays alive, but your mind slowly changes." By the 1980s and 1990s, America's death row population grew rapidly during the tough-on-crime era. Violent crime rates had risen across parts of the country. Politicians promised harsher punishment. Courts handed down more death sentences. At one point, more than 3,500 people sat on death row across the United States. Many Americans supported the punishment then. Families of victims often believed execution brought justice and closure. But critics argued the system made mistakes, treated poor defendants unfairly, and punished minorities more harshly. The debate became one of the most emotional issues in American history. Yet while politicians argued outside prison walls, inmates inside death row faced a completely different reality. For them, life became repetition. Wake up. Count time. Breakfast through a slot in the steel door. Hours alone. Another count. A short shower. A small recreation cage. Then back to the cell again. The routine repeated every day for years. In 1994, journalist Ted Conover visited several American prisons to study life inside maximum security systems. He described long corridors lined with solid steel doors and tiny windows where prisoners barely saw human faces. Guards communicated through slots and intercoms. In some units, inmates exercised alone inside concrete yards surrounded by fences and razor wire. Death row prisoners often had even fewer freedoms than general population inmates. At California's San Quentin State Prison, one of America's most famous death rows, inmates spent decades awaiting execution while appeals moved slowly through crowded courts. Some prisoners developed routines to survive mentally. They read books endlessly. They wrote letters. They memorized legal documents. Some painted. Others stared at walls for hours. A few formed distant friendships by shouting through vents or tapping messages between cells. But isolation affected everyone differently. Some prisoners became deeply religious. Others became angry. Some completely broke down. In 1983, a man named Willie Darden sat on Florida's death row after being convicted of murder. He spent years fighting appeals while living under constant threat of execution. Darden later became known internationally after public figures, including church leaders and activists, questioned aspects of his case. Supporters argued he did not receive a fair trial. Courts ultimately rejected the appeals, and Darden was executed in 1988. Cases like his fueled national arguments about fairness in the justice system. At the same time, families of victims often faced their own painful waiting process. Many waited years for executions while appeals continued through court after court. Some families said the endless legal delays reopened emotional wounds repeatedly. The system trapped everyone in years of uncertainty. Inside death row prisons, inmates carefully watched the legal process because appeals meant survival. Every hearing mattered. Every signature mattered. One successful appeal could stop an execution. One denied appeal could start the final countdown. And once an execution date arrived, prison life changed immediately. Former prison staff later described how tensions spread through entire facilities after an execution warrant was issued. Guards increased security. Inmates became quieter. Some prisoners stopped eating. Others contacted family members for final conversations. The condemned inmate often moved into a special holding area near the execution chamber in the final days. The world outside prison rarely saw this hidden process. Most Americans only heard brief news reports after executions happened. But inside death row, the waiting itself became a punishment many described as psychologically crushing. The United States Supreme Court even faced arguments over whether extremely long death row confinement was cruel and unusual punishment under the Constitution. Some justices questioned whether decades of isolation combined with execution threats created severe mental suffering. Still, executions continued. By the late 1990s, another problem deeply shook public confidence in the death penalty system. DNA testing. New scientific methods began proving that some convicted inmates were innocent. Across America, prisoners who had spent years behind bars were suddenly released after evidence cleared them. Some had even been close to execution. One major turning point came in Illinois in 2000. Governor George Ryan halted executions in the state after multiple death row inmates were exonerated. Ryan said the justice system had made too many mistakes. In a historic decision later on, he commuted the sentences of every inmate on Illinois death row. The move shocked the country. For supporters of the death penalty, it raised frightening questions. What if innocent people had already been executed? What if the system could never be completely certain? Inside prisons, death row inmates followed every news story closely. Hope could appear suddenly from a newspaper headline, a court ruling, or newly discovered evidence. But hope could disappear just as fast. In Texas, which carried out more executions than any other state in modern American history, death row procedures remained highly organized and strict. Inmates at the Polunsky Unit near Livingston lived in small solitary cells with limited contact. Meals came through slots. Recreation happened alone. Visits occurred behind thick glass barriers. Former inmates described losing track of time. Days blended together. Weeks vanished. Some prisoners counted years by executions happening around them. One inmate later explained that hearing guards walk toward nearby cells at night could trigger panic attacks. Prisoners constantly feared hearing their own names. Because on death row, nobody knew exactly when the waiting would end. Some inmates survived decades through appeals. Others exhausted all legal options much faster. And every time an execution happened, the remaining prisoners were reminded again that the system was still moving forward. The emotional pressure affected prison staff too. Correctional officers working death row units often experience stress from constant exposure to isolation, violence, and executions. Some guards later admitted they struggled emotionally after escorting inmates to execution chambers. Others believed strongly in enforcing the law and viewed executions as part of justice. The environment hardened many people. Yet moments of humanity still appeared unexpectedly. Some guards quietly spoke kindly to inmates during difficult nights. Some prisoners comforted each other through walls before executions. Religious chaplains spent years listening to condemned inmates talk about regret, fear, anger, or faith. One former prison chaplain later said death row forced everyone to confront uncomfortable questions about punishment, forgiveness, and human dignity. And nowhere were those questions more visible than inside the final days before an execution. As midnight approached inside the prison where Robert sat in silence, guards continued moving through the hallway. The inmate whose appeals had failed was now entering the last stage of the process. Final paperwork. Final legal calls. Final preparation. Robert returned slowly to his bed and sat against the cold wall. He had already spent 17 years on death row. 17 birthdays. 17 Christmases. 17 years watching men disappear down the hallway and never return. He knew the routine by heart. Outside his tiny window, darkness covered the prison yard. Inside the cell block, the silence grew heavier. Then suddenly, another inmate began shouting from somewhere far down the corridor. "I don't want to die." The voice echoed through the building again and again. No one answered. Robert closed his eyes tightly. Because by morning, the prison would begin preparing for an execution that could change everyone inside forever. And before the sun rose, one final phone call from the courts could still decide whether a man lived or died.